Two men are dead in the mountains near Iran's border with Iraq, shot outside a home in Kermanshah province. A separate firefight nearby left 4 more dead. Iran's own state television is airing a live funeral procession into its 4th day. And halfway around the world, American amphibious ships loaded with Marines are running drills built specifically around the terrain of Iran's own coastline. None of these stories are being covered together. They should be, because they are all one story, and it is happening right now in real time, on the 4th day of July's aftermath, with a ceasefire that exists mostly on paper. Start with the funeral, because the funeral is where every thread in this story currently converges. Iran's former supreme leader, killed in the opening strikes of the war that began on February 28th, is being buried across a drawn-out multi-city procession running through Tehran, Qom, Najaf, and Karbala, with burial in Mashhad. State media has spent days bringing in mourners from across the region to fill the frame. And in the middle of that funeral, senior Iranian officials have used the microphone not just to eulogize, but to threaten. A senior military advisor to the supreme leader stood before cameras and declared that Iran and Israel cannot coexist in the region, that an existential war is underway, that Iran will endure while Israel will disappear. Other officials, speaking to press covering the funeral, have said plainly that those responsible for the killing of the former supreme leader will not die a natural death, framing it as a promise rather than a threat. This is not new rhetoric in isolation. Threats against the American president specifically have been a running feature of this war since its opening days, delivered from podiums, chanted by crowds, painted on walls in Tehran. What's different about this moment is the setting. A government burying its own head of state in the same week it's negotiating a fragile continuation of a ceasefire is choosing that exact funeral to reaffirm, on the record, that it considers assassination and continued war the acceptable path forward. That's worth sitting with because it tells you plainly that whatever the diplomatic channel produces in the coming weeks, it is not being negotiated by a government that has quietly decided to stand down. It's also worth being precise about what is and isn't actually established here. Iranian officials have made public statements threatening retribution against those responsible for the killing of the former supreme leader, and separately, calls for the death of the American president specifically have been voiced at the funeral itself by at least one religious figure addressing the crowd. Those statements are real, on the record, and reported by multiple independent outlets. What has not been independently verified by any Western intelligence service or credible news organization is any specific operational plot involving outside criminal networks or coordinated logistics. Claims of that kind, when they surface in this conflict, deserve the same scrutiny as any other unverified intelligence claim. Rhetoric and stated intent are one thing, a confirmed operational plan is another, and conflating the two does a disservice to understanding how much danger is actually on the table right now. What can be said with confidence, because it's stated plainly and repeatedly by Iranian officials themselves, rather than inferred from anonymous sourcing, is that the rhetoric of assassination and existential war has become a normalized part of how this regime communicates with its own public during moments of maximum vulnerability, and a funeral for a leader killed by the very country being threatened is about as clear an example of that pattern as this conflict has produced. Meanwhile, the man who is technically now running that government has not been seen. Iran's new supreme leader, who assumed the role after his father's death, has not appeared in public, on video, or in any verified image since taking the position. He was not present at the funeral. Iranian officials have cited security concerns, the fear that any public appearance could give Israeli intelligence what it needs to locate and target him. That explanation may well be genuine. What it also means, regardless of motive, is that the country currently at the center of the most dangerous active conflict on the planet is being led, at least nominally, by a figure whose command authority, physical condition, and day-to-day involvement in decision-making cannot be independently verified by anyone outside a small circle of guard commanders. 3 of his brothers appeared at the memorial in his place. He did not. The absence has generated its own political friction inside Iran, one the regime's own supporters have had trouble fully containing. Reporting from inside the funeral proceedings described genuine surprise and confusion among crowds who had been told, in the days leading up to the event, to expect some kind of appearance from the new leader, even if only a brief one. When that appearance never materialized, and officials on the ground were asked directly why, the answers offered were notably thin, citing unspecified security concerns without further elaboration, even as the rest of the country's senior leadership stood fully exposed at the same public event. That inconsistency, an entire government leadership visible and present except for the single most important figure in it, is not the kind of detail a tightly controlled information environment usually allows to surface this cleanly. The fact that it did suggests the gap between what the regime wants the public to believe about its own command structure and what it can actually deliver has become difficult to paper over even with total control of state media. Now, to the part of this story that has gotten the least attention relative to its actual significance, what's happening on Iran's own western border, far from Tehran's cameras. In the days immediately surrounding the funeral, Iranian state media confirmed that members of its own Revolutionary Guard were killed in armed clashes near the towns of Pave and Mahabad, close to the mountainous border region with Iraq, an area with a long history of tension between Tehran and Kurdish opposition groups operating in that terrain. Iran's own reporting described a shooting that killed 2 Guard members outside a home and a separate clash. Days later, that killed several more after gunmen were engaged in the mountains between 2 border towns. A newly named Kurdish group claimed responsibility for at least one of the attacks, saying the target had a documented history of participating in the crackdown on anti-government protests. Local officials disputed some of the specific casualty details, but the core fact is not in dispute. Iranian security forces are being killed inside their own borders. In the same week, the country is staging a national funeral meant to project unity and strength. That detail matters enormously for reading everything else happening this week. A government simultaneously fighting armed opposition on its own western frontier, absorbing the loss of its senior wartime leadership over the past several months, and trying to hold a fragile negotiating position with Washington, is not a government operating from a position of confidence, regardless of how its funeral broadcasts are edited for the cameras. It's worth putting this specific unrest into its broader context, because Iran's western border regions have been a recurring flashpoint for exactly this kind of violence for years, populated heavily by Kurdish communities, with a long history of friction with the central government in Tehran. What makes the current round different is timing rather than geography. These clashes are happening during the single most tightly choreographed week of state messaging the regime has attempted all year. A national funeral designed to project unity, religious solidarity, and defiance in the face of foreign pressure. Armed opposition groups choosing this exact week to strike, rather than a quieter one, suggests a calculation of their own, that a regime distracted by managing a funeral, a leadership vacuum, and an active negotiation with Washington simultaneously has fewer resources and less attention to spare for a heightened security response on its western frontier. Whether or not that calculation proves correct, the fact that it's even a viable strategic bet for an armed opposition group says something important about how thin the regime's actual capacity has become to manage multiple crises at once. Now, to the American side of this picture, because it is not sitting still either. Since the earliest weeks of this war, the United States has been steadily assembling exactly the kind of force posture that doesn't get built for defense alone. 2 full amphibious-ready groups, one built around the assault ship Tripoli and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, the other around the assault ship Boxer and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, have been moved into the theater, together carrying more than 4,000 Marines and sailors. A contingent of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne's Rapid Response Force was deployed alongside them, a unit whose entire specialty is seizing airfields and holding key terrain on short notice. Taken together, reporting throughout the spring described nearly 7,000 additional American ground troops moved into the region since the war's opening weeks, with the Pentagon reportedly weighing whether to send several thousand more on top of that. None of this is abstract deterrence. Specific, named objectives have been reported repeatedly in defense press covering the buildup, the potential seizure or blockade of Karg Island, which processes the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports, and operations aimed at smaller Persian Gulf islands, Abu Musa, the Greater and Lesser Tums, and Larak, which sit astride the sea lanes Iran would need to control if it ever tried to fully close the strait again. Separate reporting has described this Pentagon actively weighing a complex mission to physically extract Iran's stockpile of near-weapons-grade enriched uranium, an operation that would require American forces on the ground inside the country, a category of mission with no real precedent in this conflict so far. Military analysts who study amphibious warfare have been candid about the limits of what these forces could actually accomplish. Seizing an island like Karg might work tactically and still backfire strategically, since Iran would likely respond by escalating strikes on energy infrastructure elsewhere in the Gulf, worsening the exact oil supply crisis the operation was meant to relieve. Seizing the smaller islands near the strait's narrowest point wouldn't fully secure it either, since Iran's real threat to shipping comes from its entire southern coastline, not just a handful of islands, giving it ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and long-range drones with far more launch options than any island seizure could neutralize. None of that expert skepticism has slowed the buildup. If anything, the pace of deployment throughout the spring outstripped the pace of any actual negotiated resolution, leaving the region with more hardware in position and less diplomatic progress to show for it. Look at the specific composition of what's actually been sent, because the shape of a military deployment tells you as much as any official statement about what it's actually built to do. The Boxer Group alone carries roughly 2,200 Marines and sailors across 3 ships, equipped with F-35B stealth fighters capable of short takeoff and vertical landing, alongside Osprey tiltrotor aircraft with a combat radius exceeding 700 kilometers, purpose-built for rapid insertion of troops deep inland rather than simple coastal patrol. The Tripoli Group brings a similar profile from the other direction, having transited from the Pacific through the Strait of Malacca before staging at Diego Garcia, ahead of entering the theater. The 82nd Airborne's contingent, by contrast, specializes in an entirely different mission set, seizing airfields and holding key terrain within 18 hours of an order being given, a capability that exists for exactly one purpose: establishing a foothold on hostile ground quickly before an adversary can react. None of these are units built for a defensive deterrence posture alone. They are units built for options, and the fact that Washington has assembled all three types simultaneously, sea-based assault forces, airborne rapid insertion forces, and long-range strike capability, tells you that whatever decision gets made in the coming weeks, the tools for a range of ground options, from a narrow raid to a much larger operation, already sit in place and ready. That imbalance, rising military readiness paired with stalled diplomacy, is exactly the kind of gap that tends to get filled by miscalculation rather than by design. Now overlay Iraq onto this picture, because what's happening there right now is arguably as consequential as anything unfolding in the Gulf itself, and it barely registers in most coverage of this war. Iraq's government has set the end of September as a hard deadline for every Iran-aligned armed faction operating inside the country to fully disarm and place its weapons under state control, timed to coincide with the scheduled withdrawal of the international coalition still present to fight the remnants of ISIS. Several of the larger factions have already begun handing over weapons and personnel to state authority. Others, most notably the hardline groups most tightly bound to Tehran's own military establishment, have flatly refused, insisting disarmament can only follow a complete American military withdrawal from Iraqi soil, not precede it. That is a direct public fracture inside what had functioned for years as a unified network of Iran-aligned armed groups across the country. And it is happening at the exact moment Iraq's new prime minister is preparing to travel to Washington, where American officials are expected to press him hard on following through. This matters far beyond Iraq's own borders. Tehran's entire regional strategy for the past 2 decades has rested on exactly this kind of proxy network: armed groups in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, capable of pressuring American and Israeli interests without Iran ever needing to fire a shot from its own territory. Watching that network fracture publicly, with some factions choosing disarmament and integration into state structures, while others cling to their weapons and their alignment with Tehran, is watching one of the load-bearing pillars of Iran's regional leverage crack in real time, months before the current ceasefire framework's own deadline even arrives. The specific split among these factions is worth naming plainly, because it shows this isn't a uniform Iranian retreat so much as a genuine fracture. Some of the larger groups, including 2 long-standing Iran-aligned militias, have already begun formally transferring weapons, personnel, and command structures to Iraqi state authority, describing it as a responsible step towards strengthening national institutions. A prominent Shiite cleric who commands his own separate militia made a similar move earlier in the year, placing his forces under state control well ahead of the government's own deadline. But the 2 most hardline factions in the entire Iran-aligned network have refused outright, explicitly linking any disarmament of their own to a complete withdrawal of American troops from Iraqi soil first, and describing the current disarmament push as nothing less than an occupying power dictating terms to a sovereign nation. That is a real ideological split, not a coordinated negotiating position. And it is playing out publicly through dueling statements at the exact moment Iraq's own prime minister needs to show Washington concrete progress ahead of a planned visit. A network capable of managing internal disagreement quietly, the way it has for years, would not be airing this particular disagreement through public statements to competing news outlets. The fact that it's happening in the open says something real about how much control Tehran currently has left over the pieces of its own regional apparatus. Now to a story that deserves far more attention than it has received, because it says something specific and ugly about how this regime behaves whenever it feels cornered. Iran's government has moved in recent days to seize one of the country's last surviving historic Protestant churches, a nearly 150-year-old congregation in central Tehran, established by American missionaries in the 19th century. Security officials reportedly entered the church, sat through a service to identify the people attending, and warned that they would return to evict the families living on the property and take control of the site entirely. This follows the destruction of another evangelical church in Mashhad earlier this summer, and comes against a backdrop that international religious freedom monitors have already documented in detail. Iran ranks among the worst countries in the world for Christian persecution. Arrests of Christians on religious charges nearly doubled year over year even before this latest crackdown. And advocacy groups tracking the country report that arrests accelerated sharply in the weeks immediately following the 12-day war last year, with Iranian intelligence officials explicitly framing detained converts as agents trained abroad to collaborate with foreign governments. One pastor with direct contacts inside the targeted church relayed the specific language security officials reportedly used when justifying the seizure, that Iran no longer fears the consequences of provoking the West, because it has already absorbed the worst the United States and Israel could throw at it and is still standing. Whether or not that specific framing is completely accurate, the underlying signal is clear enough. A government feeling emboldened rather than chastened by war does not usually escalate its persecution of a tiny, politically powerless religious minority. A government looking for an internal enemy it can point to, in order to explain away its own failures on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, does exactly this. Religious minorities, evangelical Christians most of all, have functioned as precisely that kind of scapegoat inside Iran during every previous period of national crisis this past decade. And human rights researchers monitoring the pattern say this crackdown is following the same script. International human rights and religious freedom monitors have laid out the scale of this campaign in stark numeric terms. Advocacy groups tracking the situation documented that arrests on religion-related charges nearly doubled in the most recent full year compared to the year before, with courts imposing prison, exile, and forced labor sentences on more than twice as many Christians as in the prior period. In the single month immediately following the end of last summer's 12-day war, Iranian authorities arrested more than 50 additional Christians, with the country's own Ministry of Intelligence explicitly justifying the wave by claiming those detained had been trained abroad to collaborate with what it called the Zionist regime, a specific accusatory framing that leaves little ambiguity about the political function these arrests are serving. The pattern extends beyond Christians, specifically. Iran's Baha'i community recorded hundreds of separate acts of persecution across the same window, and members of the country's dwindling Jewish community have faced arrests and interrogation of their own leadership as well. This is not incidental collateral damage from a war being fought elsewhere. It is a deliberate, parallel campaign of internal repression running on its own track, timed to moments when the regime feels most need to demonstrate it is still firmly in control of something, even if that something is a handful of families worshiping in a 19th century church building. None of this is happening in a vacuum from the broader war. It's happening because Tehran's leadership has calculated, evidently, that international attention is fixed almost entirely on missiles, funerals, and nuclear inspections, leaving room to quietly tighten its grip on domestic dissidents of every kind, religious or otherwise, while the world isn't watching closely enough to notice or respond. Which brings this back to the central, unresolved question hanging over the entire ceasefire framework. What actually happens when the current pause expires? The technical arrangement both governments are operating under gives them a defined window to reach something more permanent, and that window is closing faster than the pace of any real progress on the core disputes. Iran's military and diplomatic leadership have made clear, repeatedly and on the record, that they do not consider the Strait of Hormuz a fully open international waterway the way Washington insists it must be. Iranian officials have floated a payment and permit system for vessels transiting the strait, with reporting suggesting some countries, considered politically friendly to Tehran, would be granted more favorable treatment than others, a structure that functions, in practice, as exactly the kind of toll arrangement international maritime law doesn't recognize as legitimate. Washington's position remains that any deal worth signing requires the strait to reopen fully, unconditionally for everyone. Those two positions are not close to reconcilable as things currently stand, and neither side has shown genuine movement toward the other's position in the weeks since the memorandum was first signed. Layer onto that the unresolved nuclear file specifically. Satellite imagery from independent research institutions monitoring Iran's nuclear infrastructure continues to show construction activity at the deeply buried tunnel complex adjacent to the country's main enrichment site, activity that watchdog groups say sits uneasily alongside the ceasefire's own requirement that Iran maintain the status quo at nuclear-related facilities while negotiations continue. International inspectors have had no access to any of Iran's damaged nuclear sites since the war's opening day. Iran's own parliament has passed legislation specifically barring any such access until a framework for post-war inspections is established, a framework that does not yet exist and that neither side has shown much urgency in actually building. Think through what that specific combination of facts actually means for anyone trying to assess how close this conflict really is to a lasting resolution. A country can sign a memorandum promising to maintain the status quo at its nuclear facilities. It can simultaneously continue construction at a site nobody outside its own government has ever been allowed to inspect. Both of those things can be true at once, and satellite imagery is the only independent tool the outside world currently has to catch the gap between the promise and the practice. That gap has been documented repeatedly by multiple independent research institutions using commercial satellite data, not by anonymous intelligence sourcing that's impossible to verify. When a government's public diplomatic commitments and its observable physical behavior diverge this consistently, The diplomatic commitments stop functioning as a meaningful signal of intent at all. They become instead a kind of cover, language useful for buying time in front of international audiences, while the actual underlying activity continues largely unchanged underground, quite literally in this case. So here is the complete, unfiltered picture, as it stands right now, stripped of both governments' preferred framing. A funeral is being used, in part, as a platform to reaffirm threats against the sitting American president. Iran's own security forces are being killed by armed opposition inside the country's own borders. The man nominally leading the nation has not been seen since taking the role. American ground, air, and naval forces continue building toward a posture explicitly capable of seizing Iranian territory, extracting nuclear material, or both, regardless of what diplomatic language describes it as. Iraq's proxy network, one of the central pillars of Iran's regional reach, is publicly fracturing under a hard disarmament deadline just months away. A religious minority with no political power and no ability to defend itself is being targeted for property seizure and arrest as the regime looks for an internal enemy to blame. And the core disputes over the Strait and the nuclear program that actually caused this war remain as unresolved today as they were the week the ceasefire was first signed. Each of these threads, taken alone, might read as a contained story: a funeral, a border skirmish, a military exercise, a church dispute, a satellite photo. Read together, they describe something considerably larger, a government absorbing pressure on every front simultaneously, from armed opposition at home, from a fracturing proxy network abroad, from an American military posture that keeps growing regardless of what the negotiating table produces, and from its own internal contradictions about who is actually in charge and what they're capable of enforcing. Governments under that much simultaneous strain don't always collapse. Sometimes they simply keep functioning badly, for far longer than outside observers expect, absorbing blow after blow without ever quite reaching a visible breaking point. But the accumulation itself is the story here, more than any single event within it, and it is an accumulation that shows no sign of easing as the current ceasefire window continues to narrow. Wars this large rarely end with a single dramatic announcement. They end, or they don't, through exactly this kind of accumulation. Funerals that double as threats, proxies that quietly disintegrate, satellite images that quietly confirm broken promises, and military forces on both sides that keep building toward contingencies neither government will admit out loud it's actually planning for. Whether the next several weeks produce a genuine settlement or simply another extension of a ceasefire that both sides are actively preparing to break is being decided right now in exactly the places nobody's cameras are currently pointed.